as I was asked to speak about the use of ocean technologies, and also for doing so in the context of both ethics and food, you'll see that I've peppered my slides this evening with a number of proverbs, and I did so mostly for fun, but also to perhaps inspire some thoughts and maybe some subsequent discussion about how we can use ocean technology, what to remember to do, what not to do when we are exploiting these technologies, and also using ocean resources that are investigated using these technologies. A little history about myself. I, 30 years ago, transitioned from a job at Intel Corporation making microelectronics to go to graduate school at UCSD and Scripps Institution of Oceanography in an applied ocean science program. And while also working at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center on Scripps Institution's campus, I studied the accuracy and precision of echo sounder surveys of Antarctic krill. And while I was in a survey vessel, spending months at sea, going back and forth on transect lines, observing the distribution and abundance of Antarctic krill, I realized then that there was some disconnect in the spatial and temporal sampling of land-based seals and penguins that were breeding in the summer months on the Antarctic archipelago, and the prey that we were observing farther offshore from the ship. And that experience had me delving into the production of instrumented small craft that allowed us to take the sampling that we were doing from the ship and continuing it near shore within the foraging range of these seals and penguins, also developing moorings. And that put me on a path of developing ocean technologies as well as instruments and developing methods for studying organisms in the ocean. In 2010, with the prospect of a new Southwest Fisheries Science Center being constructed on the campus of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, I promoted the idea and actually helped design specify the ocean technology development tank that is part of this building. The Ocean Technology Test and Development Tank is a structure that is filled with about 2 million liters of water. The dimensions of the tank are 10 meters wide, 10 meters deep, and 20 meters long. And the water, the temperature and salinity of the water in this tank can be modulated to emulate the conditions in oceans around the world. That gives us the ability to test instrumentation, refine it, and make measurements of animals under very controlled conditions prior to going out into the ocean and making the measurements of the animals that we're trying to learn more about. For example, we have developed and tested a fast drop stereo camera system that allows us to get imagery and measurements and species identification of animals beneath the ocean surface, and a quiet, high voltage, high definition, remotely operated vehicle that allows us to get close-up and less intrusive observations of animals near the sea floor. I'm presently using technologies to observe small pelagic fish like anchovy, sardine, jack mackerel, Pacific mackerel, and herring. These species are what we call forage fish, part of the forage fish assemblage, that are also food for a number of seabirds, sharks and rays, squids, larger fish, and a number of marine mammals. Their tendency to aggregate tightly close to the surface and close to the seashore also make them easy targets for commercial fisheries. For example, the commercial fishery in Monterey for sardine that was chronicled in John Steinbeck's Cannery Row. He looked at and described the rise and fall of the sardine stock and fishery and the socioeconomic implications of this fishery. And it's not just the Monterey fishery that we consider along the west coast of North America, but there's also fisheries for small pelagics in Ensenada, Mexico, San Pedro near Los Angeles, off of Oregon and Washington near the Columbia River mouth, and then off of the west coast of Vancouver Island in Canada. The timing of these fisheries is not throughout the year, but can be modulated by the migration of these various species. The sardine stock tends to aggregate off of central and southern California during the spring and when they spawn. And then when the stock is large enough, it migrates farther north, the larger animals going farther than the smaller fish, and compresses along the coast to feed during the summer months. Before I continue to describe some of the technologies that we're using to study these fish, I'd like to stop for a moment and kind of pull back, get a global and environmental perspective on the data that we collect. So our globe, our spinning globe, is heated differentially by the sun, hotter at the equator where we have lower pressure, and cooler at the poles where there's higher pressure, and that pressure differential sets up circulation cells. And the spinning Earth gives some curvature to these atmospheric cells, and the atmospheric cells set up ocean circulation patterns, which we call oceanic gyres. Variation in the solar intensity will modulate these gyres. But along the west coast of North America, we have prevailing northern or northwesterly winds, and this acts upon the surface waters to push them south and offshore, where they are replaced by cooler, more nutrient-rich water from the deep. And these nutrients in the photic zone, or the areas where we have light, combine to cause increased productivity in phytoplankton, the basis of the food chain. So this phytoplankton growth, or the productivity of the oceans in general, are modulated by variations in the solar insolation. These upwelling regions are located around the world, shown in red. And while they comprise only about 1% of the ocean's surface area, the fish that are about 50% of the global fish harvest is taken from these areas. It's this variation in productivity that is manifested in in a phenomenon we call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index will modulate not just the productivity, but also the variation in the species composition in the ocean basin. And there are warm and cold phases to this phenomenon. A higher frequency manifestation or correlation to the PDO is we call the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, shown here on this graph, illustrates that there's about a 50 to 60 year periodicity in this phenomenon. And it's been posited that the warmer oceanic periods are conducive to sardine production, whereas the colder regimes are more conducive to anchovy production. Now this graph shows you the sinusoid indicating the cycle of the PDO and the warm and cold regimes. It also shows in the red the trajectory of the sardine biomass that is declining in conjunction with the transition from a warm to a cold period that occurred in the mid-1900s. Now there was this phenomenon that was talked about in John Steinbeck's Cannery Row. At the same time, the stock was decreasing due to lower productivity in this transition of the oceanic environment. We see that the harvest of the sardine, shown here for Monterey area in black, Oregon and Washington fisheries in the darker gray, and then the Vancouver Island fisheries farthest north in the white, were increasing during the time that this stock was gaining some pressure from the environment and decreasing. So between 1960 and 1980 approximately, the stock was depressed so low that it was hardly detectable. But as the PDO transitioned from a cold regime to a warm regime, we started to see the residual stock start to become influenced by the possibility for higher production in this onset of the warm regime. And we eventually started to see an increase in the stock biomass. And we started to see a resumption of the migration of the sardine from the Southern California area up farther north. It was at this time that the stock migration started to reach Monterey and then Oregon and Washington that the harvest took off again. It was also at this time, which is 2006, that I started to begin what we call an acoustic-trawl survey to monitor the stock of sardine, but also a number of other small pelagic fish species that I've talked about. We conduct these acoustic-trawl surveys from NOAA Fisheries survey vessels like this one here. This image shows the NOAA ship Reuben Lasker, which is based out of San Diego, and it turns out that this one is the most well-equipped of the NOAA FSVs. The ship has a number of acoustic instruments on it. These geometries show kind of a cartoon of the acoustic field that is being used to insonify animals in the ocean to understand their distribution and estimate their abundances. We have a long-range imaging sonar that looks out 360 degrees close to the ocean surface to observe fish schools that are very shallow. We have a three-dimensional imaging sonar that is used to potentially get 3D movies of fish to look at their three-dimensional structure and their behaviors. We have a multi-beam sonar that allows us to look at a large swath of the ocean and get a cross-sectional view of the distribution of fish in the context of the seabed habitat. Last, but perhaps most importantly for our surveys, is a 6-frequency echo sounder that projects down below the ship and gives us an image of the animals that are reflecting sound in the area between the sea surface and the seabed. This particular echogram is showing echoes from a variety of animals, but of interest to us in this survey are echoes from small pelagic fish schools shown in red. These small pelagic fish schools can be a variety of species. They can be, as I mentioned, sardine, anchovy, jack mackerel, Pacific mackerel, herring. And so at nighttime, when these fish ascend to the surface and spread out and do their feeding at night, we do some surface trawling and get samples of the various fish species, and we get samples to measure their length distributions. So as I shown in the echogram, there's echoes that are returning from a variety of species, and we look at what we call the acoustic signatures, both in modeling, shown in black, or this blue line here, and or validated by measurements that are made under controlled conditions, for example, in the test tank that we have at Southwest Fisheries Science Center. It's these acoustic signatures that allow us to apportion the echo energy to the various species that are present and help us to better interpret the data that we're collecting while we're at sea. So we conduct these acoustic surveys with the fisheries survey vessels along these transect lines that run perpendicular to the coast and span, in this particular survey, from the US-Mexican border up to the north end of Vancouver Island. And we get echograms like this continuously throughout the survey. The next challenge is to apportion this acoustic backscatter, or the echoes that are returning from a variety of animals, using the frequency-dependent acoustic signatures to extract just the energy that is coming from the small pelagic fish schools. We then take this information, sum the echo energy over different depth ranges, which is a process that we call echo integration. And we can plot that integrated echo energy that's attributed to small pelagic fish schools throughout the coastline map to look at their distribution. As I mentioned, we do nighttime trawling to get the species proportions in these various areas and the lengths of those various species. And we apportion these data, the echoes that are attributed to small pelagic fish, to the various species in a nearest neighbor approach. So the species proportions are used to apportion this echo data. The total energy that's integrated for a particular species is then divided by the energy for an individual of that species, representative of that length distribution, and that gives us a numerical density. We can then multiply that numerical density for, say, sardine by the area that we've surveyed, and that gives us an abundance. And if we know the mass per unit fish, we can estimate the biomass. So we do this for all the species throughout the survey area, and we can get maps and track the population trajectories and their distributions from migratory behavior and other types of behaviors, associations with the environment and things of this nature for all the different species. Shown here in red are the distributions and relative abundance shown in the different sizes of these bubbles for Pacific sardine, in blue, dark blue, jack mackerel, and light blue Pacific mackerel. This is an example of some of our data from the surveys that were conducted between the spring of 2006 and the summer of 2014. As I mentioned, we're collecting lengths, and we can use the combination of the fish densities and the abundance estimates and apportion it to length. This is one of my favorite graphs because I think it conveys quite a lot of information very succinctly, but I'll take a little bit of time here to orient you to some of the detail that hopefully you'll find interesting. The x-axis is our survey year. The y-axis is the standard length of the fish, going from the smaller sardine at the top to the largest sardine at the bottom. These bubbles are proportional to the abundance of the fish stock in that particular year, separated by fish length bin. The colors are associated with the cohort, or when these fish were recruited to the population. A couple things I'd like to point out to you is that this stock during this time period, and I'll remind you that it was transitioning from a warm period to a cold period, was comprised of basically two cohorts, and there were very few small fish, indicating that the production of this stock was low. The growth of the animals, the sardine, during this time period was contrasted or reduced by the combination of both natural mortality and fishing mortality, and the stock biomass exhibited a precipitous drop. This is the stock biomass in millions of metric tons, and the black is the biomass, red on this y-axis, and the gray bars, which maybe you can see from your seat, are indicating the 95% confidence intervals of our survey estimates for this stock. It was during this time that we were exhibiting this precipitous drop with only two cohorts that were dominating the population, that the exploitation, shown in the gray, increased. In 2015, the exploitation stopped as the fishery was closed. The stock biomass fell below a management threshold, population threshold. Even before 2015, though, there was a lot of indications that the things that we were observing through the acoustic survey results were indicative of kind of a replication of what was observed historically in the Cannery Row events in the mid-1900s. We published a paper in 2012 that expressed the ideas that the environment was transitioning to a cold period that was less conducive to sardine production. The stock was comprised of very few cohorts, making it less resilient to variations in the environment. And there was an increased harvest by the northern fisheries, which were taking the largest, most fecund fish. So coincident with the decline of the principal component of the forage fish assemblage, sardine, we saw that there was mass strandings, deaths, and reproductive failures in the sardine predators. There just wasn't enough forage fish to support all the animals that were reliant upon them. So we wondered at that time, now that the environment was transitioning to another cold regime, which people have hypothesized would support anchovy production, would indeed anchovy start to resurge. Well, we hadn't seen much anchovy through the surveys between 2008 and 2014, but in 2015 we started to see signs of anchovy in our trawl catches in the area between San Diego and just north of San Francisco. They're very small, young of the year anchovy, and there was a sign that it was quite a large recruitment. In 2016, we surveyed the same areas, and we saw not only had the population increased in size and biomass, but it had extended throughout the historical range of what we call the central stock of northern anchovy. We continued the surveys even through this year, and we saw that this new recruitment event for anchovy that we first observed in 2015 increased in size and increased in biomass. And you can also observe that how rapidly these things can change. These small pelagic fish respond very rapidly to environmental conditions, and when conditions are good, the stocks can rebound quite rapidly, as is evidenced by these results. So we conduct our surveys, as I mentioned, by these large fisheries survey vessels. The Reuben Lasker's on the order of 210 feet long. It's quite expensive to operate, and for that reason, the surveys which began in 2006, both in the spring and summer of each year, have been cut back, and now we're conducting the surveys only once per year in the summer. And there are some limitations to these surveys. They don't necessarily survey all the way into bays, which there might be some additional portions of the population. The ship can't safely navigate very close to shore. And so for these three reasons, primarily, the possibility that we might not have enough ship time to continue the surveys at the frequency that we would like, and that there are times when we need an alternative survey platform to survey when, where, and how the ship can't survey, that has motivated us to look at alternative platforms, principally autonomous platforms. In 2010, my group began developing, in conjunction with industry, an autonomous underwater vehicle that was fitted with custom fisheries instrumentation, an echo sounder, an acoustic Doppler current profiler to measure water currents, a stereo camera to get optical imagery of the various fish species that were echoing sound. We've also, in 2018, collaborated with a company called Sail Drone out of Alameda, California, to use autonomous wind-powered vessels that have acoustic instrumentation on them as well. And with 5 of them, during the same time that we surveyed the West Coast with our ship, surveyed all the transect lines with these drones called sail drones. In addition to just replicating the transects that we've done with the ship for comparison, we also tested the ideas of doing some augmentation of the data streams that we're getting from the ship. We've sampled much closer to shore, and we sampled a transect line repeatedly off of Point Conception that is an experiment to look at whether or not we can use continuous measurements to get estimates of the abundances of migrating fish populations and to look at the timings of their migration. Also off of this Point Conception, we're working with Scripps Institution of Oceanography to deploy highly instrumented mooring arrays. I have echo sounders on these arrays that will allow us to track the depth distribution and the migration times and perhaps the abundances of fish that move past this point. Scripps also has what they call buoyancy gliders, shown here, the spray glider that can be instrumented as well with acoustics and other oceanographic instrumentation, and can do sawtooth trajectories along this transect line to get ocean observations as well. My group and I have developed a lander system that gives us the ability to continuously monitor acoustic backscatter from echo sounders that are providing wide bandwidth information that gives us quite a lot more possibilities for remote sensing and species identification. It also has hydrophones on board to look at variations in sounds that are being generated by some species of fish. So before I continue, I'd like to take another step back and kind of put all this research into a larger context. Why is it that we're doing these studies? Well, one reason for me is the recognition that just in my lifetime, the human population has grown from about 3.5 billion people to now over 7 billion people. And by 2040, it's expected it's going to exceed 9 billion. Well, with all these people eating an increasing amount of fish, the wild fish stocks are increasingly being overfished. The number of fish stocks that are fully exploited is increasing, and the number of fish stocks that are being overfished is increasing. Not only are there more people, but in the last 25 years, there's been a tendency for the humans to eat more fish. The per capita consumption of fish during this period is almost doubled. The additional fish that are feeding us all is increasingly coming from aquaculture. Aquaculture is being done worldwide to try to meet the demands of the human needs for protein. But one consideration that we're grappling with at the moment is much of this aquaculture is developing or producing fish that are larger and higher on the food chain. And the agency and industry are working, endeavoring to address the issue that much of it, or most of the aquaculture, is being fed meal that is derived from the reduction of wild small pelagic fish. The agency is conducting this research to be responsive principally to the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act that was put in place in 1976. There are multiple objectives to this. The principal objectives, I should say, are to prevent overfishing. There's also, in the cases that overfishing occurs, the need to act and try to mitigate this phenomenon. There's also competing interests, and another objective is to increase long-term economic and social benefits, and to do so while ensuring a safe and sustainable seafood supply. So there's a lot of different subjects that we're addressing tonight. I've talked a little bit about ocean technology that we're using for fish. We've talked about ethics. We've talked about food. I've interjected, as I said, for fun, but also to try to inspire some conversation, a number of proverbs. And I've also derived one myself that I'll put out there. It's inspired by the equation that we use for compound interest. And it goes like this, that in nature's interest, I think we should consider the environment and not eat the principle. So I'll remind you that things I said tonight are my opinions and mine only, and I would like, when the time is appropriate, to try to answer some of your questions. Thank you.
One of the very first questions that I got for David is, I'd like to know more about the cold versus warm anchovies versus sardines. Is there a specific adaptation that causes the temperature preference in the species?
There's quite a lot of research that's being done to try to answer this question. Some of the research that's been done thus far points to the different feed adaptations that the different species have, and the different zooplankton species that result or that are produced during these different regimes that are more accessed by the feeding mechanisms or the feeding behaviors of anchovy versus sardine.
And to further that, I mean, when what you were saying in the presentation, the sardines are gradually migrating up the coast, it seems. Is there a good chance that they'll be gone from the California coast?
So sardine have a migration off of central and southern California during this winter and spring period, where they do their reproduction, spawn, and during the summer months they compress along the coast and migrate north. So it's not necessarily an onshore, offshore, it's more north and south. As the stock decreased in size, the annual migration or the seasonal migration contracted. When the stock size got below approximately 750,000 tons, the migration stopped, and when the stock increased above more or less that same level, the migration resumed. It's unsure where this stock contracts to exactly, but it appears as though it's contracted into the Southern California area. I should mention that there are multiple stocks of sardine. The one stock that I've been speaking about we call the northern subpopulation of sardine. And synchronously with the migration of this stock between California and farther north, there's a migration of a central stock of sardine that comes up from Baja California into the Southern California bight. There's research being done for decades now trying to understand whether these stocks during times when the populations are low mix or whether they remain separate.
And then another question that I had when you were going through the presentation too is you said that some of the larger predatory species were disappearing. They're not feeding off the fish as often. What kind of species are those? I know you had the picture of the seal with the fish in the circle.
Okay, so there's California sea lions, and if I gave the impression that they're disappearing, that's incorrect.
Right.
They were challenged by a lower food source, and there are brown pelicans that were having some difficulties during these times as well. Mewers, there's a number of species that reliant upon small pelagic fish that felt the effects of a decrease in the total forage fish assemblage during this time.
And then another question that we have is, are strategies to support sustainable fish populations working? It's a loaded question.
It's a loaded question because the characterization of sustainability in fish stocks, particularly those related to small pelagics, might not lend itself to what you might think is sustainable. As I mentioned, the environment has very strong influence on the population abundance, and these stocks can go in what we call boom and bust cycles very, very rapidly. And it's a challenge to think about a stock that goes through these ups and downs in terms of sustainability. And it's this influencing the environment that gives rise to the conversation about what is causing the reduction of the population biomass. Is it human exploitation? Is it the environment? Would the decrease in the abundance occur irrespective of harvesting pressure and things of this nature?
And then they followed that question with this, and you were presenting this in your presentation, and it says, will we have enough fish populations to really feed the world as it's growing? Will we be able to sustain what we have, or is it gradually going to disappear? Because you're an expert on this, you study this, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, close to the end of my presentation, I showed a graph that was produced by the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, that showed a fairly constant level of seafood that's being supplied from wild stocks, and a larger increase in the amount of seafood that's coming now from aquaculture. There could be multiple reasons for that. Getting better at aquaculture, it's becoming a higher priority for humans to produce food through aquaculture. It can also be driven by the increasing difficulty in extracting more and more food from the ocean, from these wild stocks. So it could be, in some sense, kind of reached a capacity to extract wild fish from the oceans. But I guess to be honest about this, my expertise is more in the technologies that we use to study the fishes and zooplankton, and developing instrument platforms that are used to put those instruments out into the ocean. So I guess I maybe use this segue to see if there's any questions more about the technologies that I use.
I do have a question about the tech. I have quite a few. Are there any legal restraints that keep you from using this technology in certain areas?
There are requirements to get permits, even for the federal government, when we do these surveys, when we're operating and conducting trawls in state waters, for example, or international waters, or in marine protected areas. And so those are some of the restrictions that we have for using this type of technology. There are some, I guess those are probably some of the main limitations. Some of the other limitations are more physical constraints, operating safely in nearshore environments, in bays, in highly trafficked areas, shipping channels, in areas where crab pots are deployed, things of this nature. I was been fascinated by this question. It's a good one. I love this question. It says, what stops somebody from adapting or taking advantage of this technology to find and exploit endangered populations? Is that a concern that somebody could hack into this technology? I think that the application of the technologies that we use for studying the fish populations and getting high quality information about their distributions and their abundances and the species alternations and things is limited by, number one, the cost of the instruments and the ship time that we require to collect this information, and also the expertise that's necessary to extract the information from the remote samples and the statistical sampling. But that said, there are a number of fishers and fishing companies that do have this type of technology and the expertise to use it. And so the limitation there is their desire to maintain sustainable fisheries, to continue with their business operation, and also the limitations that are imposed through regulation.
And then a question from somebody is, what sustainable ways can be created to prevent overfishing?
I think but even much more so, the management arms of our agency grapple with this continuously. As I mentioned, the Magnuson-Stevens Act has a lot of objectives, and some of them are foremost to avoid overfishing and to deal with overfishing when it occurs, but there's also socioeconomic considerations that they have in the mix, and there's a number of constituents and stakeholders that compete for the development and the implementation of different management policies.
Another question. I'll keep it technology related. We're going to go back and forth from general questions to technology questions. In terms of this technology, what would you say is, where do you see the future going with this technology?
Well, it seems clear to me that we are doing more sampling with a larger number of instruments and collecting even more data from autonomous platforms. When I began doing this 30 years ago, everything was done from from a survey vessel. And gradually over this time period, we've evolved to collecting the data from highly instrumented small craft to buoys, and now more and more routinely we're making measurements from autonomous underwater vehicles, autonomous surface vehicles, from aerial drones, and this type of thing. So that's the trajectory as far as the instrument platforms. The trajectory for instrumentation, I think, is we're getting more and more ability to do remote sensing of not just large differences in taxon, large fish versus small zooplankton, but discern whether or not the fish or the zooplankton have gas inclusions. And we're incrementally advancing towards, in some cases, getting some species differentiation. And that process is not being done just through the information we can extract from the echo, but combining that information with a variety of information data sources. For example, learning whether these echoes are measured near shore or offshore in association with certain water masses, have some different types of distinguishing aggregation behavior. And by putting together data from a lot of different sources and perhaps doing so using big data sources and artificial intelligence, we're making some larger advances in this type of remote species identification, which has been kind of the holy grail of my business.
Right. And then another good technological question, it's a little bit similar but different to a question we asked. Is there a risk of the misuse of this technology or the data you collect?
I think a previous question kind of alluded to the possibility that, we're understanding on global scales now the distributions of environmental parameters, and we're understanding the influence of those parameters on animal distributions, and we're getting quite good now at mapping animal distributions and tracking them. It's going to be less and less easy for wild animals to escape our observations. That has, it's a double-edged sword like all of technology, I think. We know better how much life there is out there, and that gives us the ability to manage it better, but it also gives us the ability to exploit it more efficiently.
A good question for us as students and faculty. I mean, from your perspective, there are things that fishermen can do to preserve fish populations, but is there anything that we as students and faculty can do to I mean, we're having a growing population. You said that the population is going to hit 9 billion in our lifetime, which is a lot. I mean, what responsibility do we have, what ethical responsibility do we as students and faculty have to preserve these fish populations, would you say? And are there any actions that we can take?
I think the answer to that, at least from my perspective, is not limited to fish, but all natural resources. I find that actions that have some effect are mostly those that originate with people's involvement, their education of the issues, and their active participation in the management procedures and systems that we've set up to try to have a positive effect when we are exploiting natural resources. So learning about the issues and becoming actively involved in the regional fisheries management organizations are some possibilities. And then I think more generally, as I understand it, eating lower on the food chain is something that we can do actively day to day that might have collectively an impact on the sustainability of ocean marine life.
And these are some questions that I've asked, but I think the audience might find these fascinating. It's not the technological, but it's just, I find it all fascinating. You're from Arizona. You were born and raised in Arizona, and yet you travel the world studying fish populations. What got you interested in the ocean and fish?
I think because I came from Arizona. I grew up in Tucson. It was relatively small. It's probably grown by fourfold since I grew up there. There was limited things to do. I spent a lot of time in Southern California playing water polo and swimming competitively, trying to learn to surf. And during that time period, I stumbled upon a career fair that was going on at Southwest Fisheries Science Center. That opened my eyes to the possibilities of potentially being employed in this field. And I forgot about it for a while, went back and studied electrical and computer engineering at University of Arizona. Worked at Intel Corporation, and through one of my visits back to Arizona to play water polo, I was questioned by a person on the team, why aren't you studying oceanography? Got me thinking again, and that kind of put me back on a track to get admitted to UCSD and their Applied Ocean Science program that merged electrical and computer engineering with oceanographic investigations, and got reconnected with the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, was asked by the director of the Antarctic Ecosystems Research Group to use some of my skills in computing, Unix system administration, echo sounder technology, digital signal processing, and apply it to studies of krill. I guess I've told you much of the rest of the story.
Right, right. And I remember you lived in Antarctica for a while studying krill populations, and you have a very fascinating history with all of this. And I think that we as students, we're going to Grossmont, a lot of us. Most of us here are Grossmont College students, faculty, and we live next to the ocean. And I know from talking to students that they have a fascination with the ocean. I think that a lot of students here might have an interest in being an oceanographer in the future. What advice would you have for the students here who are thinking about pursuing that path?
I think perhaps the main thing is to recognize that oceanography has a lot of sub-disciplines. There's chemical oceanography, physical oceanography, biological and geological oceanography, and within each of those different disciplines there's a number of sub-disciplines. You might imagine that the number of disciplines associated with studying the oceans is probably equivalent to those that are associated with studying land or space in the atmosphere. So it's quite a diverse opportunity, and I think getting out, looking for perhaps internships or other opportunities that will expose you to different aspects of oceanography is something that might help you focus both your studies and the development of talents that could be distinguishing at some point. I started to work on digital signal processing and computing. I had some electronics background. Somebody might look at developing GIS skills or computer-aided design skills. They might manufacturing technology. There's a lot of that going on in development of ocean technologies. I think the main point there is you need to distinguish yourself from all of the other people that, or a number of other people that are also interested in getting involved in oceanography and becoming employed at some point in that field. And I also find that it's an important thing, not just in oceanography, but probably perhaps any professional career to hone your writing skills.
I like that answer a lot. I teach English here. Another question that I had, I went to UCSD in Scripps and I saw this fish tank that you have, and it's humongous. It's the biggest fish tank I've ever seen in my life. And I know that you're talking about you study fish populations in that tank. What types of populations have you studied in that tank?
They're very small if they're in that tank, but the species, various species that we study in the ocean and the populations that we're trying to understand in the oceans, we put into the tank to try to understand how the animals of different sizes and orientations reflects sound as a function of frequency. So we put sardine and we've anchovy, krill, and other animals that we study with the echo sounders in the ocean into the tank, and that gives us the ability to in controlled fashion, modulate some of the more important parameters that might affect their acoustic reflectivity.
And I just had a couple more questions. One would be, I know that we have threatened species right off our coast, fish species specifically, and do you feel that your technology has a chance to help the species gain balance again?
Some depleted rockfish populations are off of our coast, and I've spent maybe 8 years studying rockfish that were too depleted to take subsamples of them, and not only that, that they are located in what we call untrawlable rocky reef areas. And we've developed technology combinations using multi-frequency acoustic echo sounders, multi-beam sonars to map the bathymetry and to classify the seabed type in conjunction with the distributions of the rockfish that are present in these areas. And then instead of using trawls, we use the maps that we create acoustically to create navigational tools to drive the remotely operated vehicles through these aggregations. And that gives us the ability to determine the species proportions of the rockfish and get estimates of their length distributions. And by the combination of the acoustic backscatter that we measure from these rockfish aggregations and then apportioning that to species and lengths, we can get population estimates of their abundance by species. And by repeated surveys of this type, we can track the recovery of these depleted stocks. That's one thing we've been doing.
And then I know that this is a complicated question. I don't know if you can answer it, but are there any ethical concerns with the technology you're using, with the sonars you're using? Is there any damage they might do to the ecosystem that you would know of? Or what things have you done to try to facilitate that so it doesn't harm the species? So
the two principal sampling techniques that I talked about were the echo sounders and the trawling. The echo sounders are transmitting very short duration high-frequency pulses of sound that are inaudible to fish and to humans. And I've swam underneath the transducers. It's not a concern to me. It doesn't appear to change the behavior of the fish that we've had in the tank and observing closely with eye and video. There's been a lot of work on looking at the perception of these frequencies and transmit power levels that indicate that they don't have the sensitivity to these remote sensing pulses of sound. Lower frequencies they're more adapted to, and we're not using those. Probably more invasive, much more invasive is the capture of samples of fish through the trawls. And as I mentioned, we don't do that when the stocks are depleted that we're sampling. We do it for these small pelagic fish, and that gives us the species proportions and lengths, as I mentioned. But one of the more perhaps concerning issues is that these large trawls can have the possibility of capturing animals that we don't intend to capture. We would like to have just samples of the small pelagic fish that we're targeting and trying to estimate the abundances for. But we don't close our eyes to the fact that these large trawls can potentially capture animals that are foraging upon these small pelagics. And so we put pingers on the head rope and the foot rope of these trawls that make noise that our large cetaceans are sensitive to, and it kind of shouts out to dolphins and seals, a net is approaching. We also put bars and what we call a marine mammal excluder device in the nets that allows large animals that, if they do enter the net, will get shunted out of the net. So there's a number of mitigation measures that we try to put in place. In addition to those strategies for mitigating risk, we also have marine mammal watches before any of our trawls to try to ensure that there are no marine mammals in the area. And we're trying to develop now passive acoustic techniques where we're not only looking with eyes and other tools to detect them optically, but we're also listening for sounds that they generate to see if there are any animals that we should try to avoid in the area that we're doing trawls. And if there are, then we stop the trawling activity and move to another area.
I just have more and more questions as I listen, because I love this topic, and I'm very fascinated by fish, and I teach this with my students. We go over to these topics, and I don't know if you could answer this question, but I know that there are issues with fish farming, and you were pointing some of those issues out earlier about how we need to feed smaller fish, but I know that one of the issues that we've had with fish farming is that some of these species are escaping, so they're genetically modified superfish. I was reading in the newspaper that they've developed salmon that can grow 2 times the size of salmon. And some of the issues are that these fish are getting out of these cages or these areas and breeding with other fish. And I know that's more of a problem for salmon species, but I don't know if this would be a problem for, I know that they're fishing tuna off our coast and things like that. Is this an issue off our coast, would you say? I don't know if you could answer that question, I'm just curious.
I don't think I have a good answer for that.
Right.
There's a lot of the types of aquaculture that you're discussing advancing for decades now in other areas of the world. We're starting to do much more of that in the United States. The National Marine Fisheries Service is trying to foster the development of aquaculture at a larger level. It's anticipated that by 2025 that approximately 2/3 of the global seafood supply will come from aquaculture. So there's a lot of development that's going to be necessary for that to occur, and there's a lot of challenges that we're going to have to address. It's probably no different than the humans' push towards from harvesting animals, natural populations of animals to farming, or from harvesting plants and their produce to the agriculture. I think that when you start to do things on very large scales, it requires a lot of forethought, and unfortunately, there's going to be trial and error.
Okay, I believe this concludes our presentation. I'd like to give a round of applause